March 25th, 1983. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The rehearsal room smelled like floor wax and stale coffee, and Richard Holloway had already made up his mind before Michael Jackson finished his sentence. "No," he said. Just that one word, flat and final, like he was closing a door. Michael was holding a single sheet of paper, handwritten notes, his own handwriting, the plan he'd been quietly building for weeks. Not the half-finished version people had glimpsed in previous shows. Something different. Something he'd been working on in private, alone, in his bedroom, on kitchen tiles, in hotel hallways at 2 a.m. A move that didn't have a name yet. A move that the floor seemed to want to help him do. Holloway didn't look at the paper. "It doesn't fit," he said, already turning toward the production table. "It looks like a carnival trick. We are not doing carnival tricks at Motown's 25th anniversary. This is a prestige event." The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been said. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He stood there with those dark, steady eyes fixed on Holloway and said, "I've been working on this for a long time." Holloway turned around slowly. He was 54 years old, 12 Broadway productions, 30 years in the industry, a reputation for precision that he wore the way other men wear expensive watches, visibly and constantly. He had a second reputation, the one people mentioned in lower voices, for not having much patience for what he called performer ego. Michael, the tone was the patient one, the one that isn't actually patient at all. "You are a singer, a genuinely great singer. That is what you need to be tonight. The choreography has been approved. What you're describing doesn't belong in it." He picked up his clipboard and walked out. And here is the thing that almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. Not the moonwalk, not the sequined glove, not the 47 million people sitting in front of their television sets. The moment that actually determines what happens next is this one. Michael Jackson standing alone in a rehearsal room, looking at a sheet of paper and saying absolutely nothing. Because what he did in that silence is what separated him from every other person in that building. To understand why Holloway's dismissal landed the way it did, you need to understand what that night actually was. Motown's 25th anniversary special was the kind of event that only happens once. Every legend in black music history was either on that stage or in that audience. Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, the Four Tops. NBC had been promoting it for weeks. The projections were enormous. This was not a regular broadcast. This was a coronation. And Michael Jackson, at 24 years old, was standing in the most uncomfortable position imaginable. Thriller had already sold 22 million copies. By every commercial measure that existed, he was the biggest artist on earth. But the biggest artist on earth is not automatically the most respected person in every room. There were still producers who thought the success was Quincy Jones's doing. There were still executives who treated him like a child star who hadn't quite finished his story. And there were choreographers, men like Holloway, who had built entire identities around Broadway, in opera and classical performance, and who looked at pop music the way a landlord looks at a noisy tenant, tolerant but barely. What Michael wanted to do that night was not just a dance move. It was a statement. It was him saying in the clearest possible physical language that what he did was real, that pop music was real, that a 24-year-old from Gary, Indiana, had invented something that no amount of classical training or Broadway credentials could replicate or dismiss. Holloway didn't see any of that. He saw a performer getting ideas. That evening, Holloway sent a formal written note to the show's producers. The move Michael had described was not approved. It would disrupt the choreographic integrity of the segment. If Michael insisted on including it, the production would need to reconsider Holloway's involvement going forward. The producers sat with it for about an hour. They had a show to protect, sponsors to consider, a network relationship they didn't want to strain. And Holloway was Holloway. His name carried weight in these rooms. So they made the call that powerful people make when they choose the safe option over the right one. The moonwalk was pulled from Michael's approved set plan. The stage director, a quiet man named Leonard Park, who'd been in live television for 20 years, found Michael backstage around 9 in the evening. He stood in the hallway with his clipboard pressed against his chest and laid it out simply. The plan had changed. Tonight, Michael would stay within the approved choreography. The producers had signed off on that version. That was the version going to air. Michael stood very still while Leonard talked. He had a way of listening that made you feel like you were being studied without being observed. Like he was filing everything away somewhere private, not reacting, just receiving. When Leonard finished, Michael looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said. Leonard Park walked away thinking that was the end of it. He would spend the rest of his career thinking about how completely wrong he was. The night of the taping was electric in the specific way live television is electric. The audience inside the Pasadena Civic Auditorium pressed together, warm and loud, the kind of crowd that had already decided they were seeing history. The Jackson brothers performed first, a medley of old hits, Jackie and Tito and Jermaine and Marlon moving through the choreography exactly as approved, exactly where Holloway's plan said they should be. Then Michael stepped to the front of the stage, alone. He was wearing a sequined black jacket over a white shirt, one silver glove, black trousers, and white socks. He looked younger than 24. He always looked younger than whatever age he actually was. Something permanently boyish about his face, about the way he stood, slightly folded in on himself, like a person waiting for something to begin. The opening notes of Billie Jean hit the room. If you have never actually watched the recording of that specific moment, you cannot fully understand what happened to Michael Jackson when the music started. It was not gradual. It was not a warm-up. It was instantaneous. The boy standing there a second ago was simply gone, and something else had taken his place. Something precise and deliberate and completely certain of itself in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a person who knows exactly what they are. He moved through the first minute the way the approved choreography required. Clean, controlled, on the marks. And then he stopped. Not a stumble, a decision. His right hand came up slowly, gripped the brim of his hat, and tilted it forward until his eyes were half in shadow. 3,500 people in that auditorium went quiet in the same half second. Something was happening that was not on the schedule. He rose on the toe of his right shoe, and then he slid, backward, both feet moving across the stage like gravity had briefly renegotiated its terms with him. Like the floor had become something cooperative, like he was not moving through space at all, but through something else entirely, something that didn't have a name in physics. For 2 full seconds, nobody in that building made a sound. Then the Pasadena Civic Auditorium came apart. Richard Holloway was watching from the wings. The people standing near him that night would later describe different versions of his face in that moment. One account said he went pale. Another said he grabbed the railing next to him. A grip technician who had been positioned 12 feet to Holloway's left said he turned to the person nearest him, opened his mouth and closed it again without producing a single word. Michael did not look at him. Michael did not look at anyone in particular. He looked at the place where the audience ended and the darkness of the back wall began, and he held that brim, and he stood there while the noise built into something that did not sound like applause. It was rawer than that, more involuntary, the sound people make when something happens that they don't have a category for yet. The grip technician, interviewed years later, remembered what Holloway finally said. He shouldn't have done that. Nobody near him responded. They were all watching Michael. The next morning began the way extraordinary mornings do, with a phone call nobody saw coming. Fred Astaire was 83 years old and had watched the special from his home. He got Michael's number through a mutual contact, picked up the phone, and called. He told Michael he had seen the moonwalk. He told him he had watched it 3 times, rewinding the tape on his VCR to make sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. "You're a hell of a mover," Astaire said. "Don't let anybody tell you different." There was a pause on Michael's end of the line, a long one. Michael sat down on the floor of his hotel room and cried. He wasn't crying about Holloway. He wasn't crying about the formal note to the producers, or the revised set list, or the people who had chosen the safe option over the right one. He was crying because Fred Astaire, who had spent 60 years showing the world what a human body was capable of on camera, had watched him and recognized something real in it, had gone back and watched it again, had picked up the phone. The ratings came 3 days later. 47 million viewers. the highest-rated entertainment special in NBC's history at that point. Calls flooded into the network and into Motown and into Michael's management. People wanted to know who he was. They wanted to see it again. They wanted to know what that move was called. Within a week, every major newspaper in the country had covered the moonwalk. Within a month, it was being attempted on kitchen floors and in high school gyms and on sidewalks across America. Within a year, it existed in 30 countries and had become the most recognizable single movement in the history of popular performance. Richard Holloway continued working. He had a long career in Broadway choreography, well-respected and decorated. He never gave an interview about Motown 25. As far as anyone can determine, he never publicly mentioned Michael Jackson again. Michael never explained the moonwalk in any formal interview. He talked around it, where it came from, the tap dancers he'd studied, the physics of it, the hours he'd spent alone on it. He never once said, "I did this because someone told me I couldn't." He never pointed at anyone and said, "You were wrong." He didn't need to. The move had already said everything. That is the thing about people who answer doubt with work instead of words. They don't need to announce the lesson. They don't need to make sure the right person is watching when it happens. They just do the thing that leaves no room for argument, and they let whatever silence follows do whatever it needs to do. March 25th, 1983 was the night the world found out what Michael Jackson actually was. Not a child star who got lucky, not Quincy Jones's best project, not a singer who had wandered too far into choreography that wasn't his. He was the king of pop, and kings don't ask choreographers for permission. Now, was there ever a moment when someone told you that you couldn't do something, and instead of arguing, you just went and did it? Leave it in the comments. I genuinely want to know.